Hello, everyone. Welcome to this freeform episode of the Mindful in Minutes podcast. So, I'm Kelly, and today we are going to be doing a freeform episode. So, no guided meditation here on perfectionism. I think this is one of the longest running requested topics that I've had every time I put out like on IG or anything like that for requests for topics. Perfectionism and releasing it always comes up. And I thought, you know what? It's time. Let's talk about it. Let's tackle it. Let's explore perfectionism. So, what I'm kind of thinking for today in my little notes here is not only talking about what perfectionism is, of course, but exploring how it can show up in your life. There's a lot of different ways that perfectionism can kind of creep in that's beyond just kind of the traditional wanting things to be, quote, perfect. I'm also going to share my personal brand of perfectionism because I definitely have struggled with this in the past, and my perfectionism does not necessarily show up in a traditional way. And then I'm going to share some thoughts and tips and practices to hopefully help us just soften and ease perfectionism so we can maybe just move past it or just make it a little bit smaller. So the first thing that I want to just sort of leave you with is that perfection does not exist. So when we're talking about perfectionism, just first and foremost, I guess this technically could be at the end when I share tips and tricks, but like the biggest thing that I have learned about perfectionism is that perfection doesn't exist. You are chasing an impossible thing. Perfect just doesn't exist. It's like this nice little, unicorn idea that we love to chase, but I think we're just setting ourselves up for failure because it doesn't exist. It doesn't even exist like in nature. Everything in nature is unique. It's a little bit different. And there is no like carbon copy, quote, perfect in nature. Of course, there's some instances where things are like really symmetrical or like maybe there's really interesting shapes involved, but like perfection doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in nature. It doesn't exist in us. So that's kind of like first and foremost. I'm going to ask you to embrace that as we explore perfectionism just for our next bit of time together of like perfect doesn't exist. And so when we are trying to chase something that doesn't exist, we are just setting ourselves up for failure. We can't succeed in doing something that doesn't exist. And if every once in a while we do kind of get something like, quote, perfect, I feel like sometimes it's kind of a fluke. It's maybe a happy accident. But that's what makes it so hard to replicate is because you're trying to replicate a happy accident. And that's just not how it goes in life. All right, so kicking it off with what is perfectionism? We've got to start it off with like just a good old definition. What are we talking about? So perfectionism is a trait or mindset characterized by a strong desire for flawlessness and an unrelenting pursuit of high standards and achievements. So basically, it is just this trait that one can have where you really just want things to be flawless. You have these super high standards, you are really high achieving, and you just keep going until something is perfect. So perfectionists are often people who set extremely high, often unattainable standards for themselves. And they also tend to be really critical of their own performance and achievement, which I feel like is such a big piece of perfectionism, is that perfectionism and that kind of inner critic, that inner mean girl, mean person, that voice within you can be so strong and so loud. And when you're dealing with perfectionism, you can often just really be driven by like the fear of making mistakes or falling short of others' expectations. And I just think and I kind of consider myself a somewhat reformed perfectionist. Not always. We'll talk about my, where my soft spot is in just a little bit. But in terms of like thinking about others' expectations, something that I've personally learned about others' expectations is that usually our perception of other people's expectations is so much higher than what their expectations actually are. So unless someone clearly says, like, here are my expectations are A, B, and C, which honestly is kind of nice when someone does that, because then you're like, okay, I know what your expectations are. And then you can either do it or not do it. But I think we often kind of get stuck in this trap of like, you think you know what someone's expectations are, but then their expectations might either be different or usually like lower. And I don't mean lower in a bad way. I mean like you might perceive their expectations to be unrealistic, unattainable, or these super high expectations, where in reality, someone's expectations of you might be a little bit more realistic. And we kind of just get stuck in this like trap of thinking someone has really, really high expectations for us, that are pushing ourselves to meet those impossible standards. And then it just keeps going and going and going in this loop. And so something that I've just learned is that I don't think anyone has ever had higher expectations for me than myself. Like even people that have pushed me or challenged me, or, you know, when I was working in a more traditional workplace, the expectations that I set for myself or my perception of others' expectations for me was so much higher than the reality. And so that's something that like just off the bat, that once I kind of realized that, it just really helped me to kind of release some of my own perfectionism in terms of like letting people down or falling short of someone else's expectations. Because really I realized it was more of like a me problem and not like an others problem. So what does perfectionism often look like? So often, not always, with perfectionism, kind of the trademark qualities of perfectionism, high standards. So perfectionists set exceptionally high standards for themselves. And this can be in different aspects of life, right? It can be work, relationships, personal achievements. The standards that we're setting for ourselves when we're perfectionists are usually unrealistic and difficult to meet. And I think it's important to remember that we can have these high standards in any aspect of our life. It can be totally different. Maybe we're not necessarily a perfectionist when it comes to like our relationships, but at work we are, or somewhere else in our lives. And so thinking about, is there a place in your life where maybe you are personally setting these unattainable standards for yourself, or like these really high standards that are difficult to meet? Perfectionism usually comes with a fear of failure. So one of the core aspects of perfectionism is like this deep fear of failure or making mistakes. So if you're a perfectionist, you may go to great lengths to avoid situations where you might fall short, even if it means like missing out on an opportunity, missing out on a chance for growth. For me, often I see kind of this fear of failure and perfectionism coming together as like stopping before you even start. So it's like, why try a new endeavor? Why follow a dream? Why do something different if you just might fail? It's like often from my experience, working with kind of this fear of failure for myself, but also seeing it in people that are close to me, and then working with clients and students closely, is that this fear of failure, it's like it's easier to just hold yourself back, because if you just stay in the comfortable, if you hold yourself back, you probably won't fail because you're already doing those things really well. Self-criticism is a big piece of perfectionism. Perfectionists tend to be so highly critical and self-demanding. They constantly are, evaluating their performance, maybe comparing themselves to others, being really hard on themselves for what they perceive as a shortcoming. And again, usually it's your perception of the situation and not the reality, and just being really, really hard and critical on yourself. That inner critic can be extremely loud when you're struggling with perfectionism. And then procrastination. So sometimes goes hand in hand with that fear of failure. Not always, but sometimes. And sometimes when you're struggling with perfectionism, instead of kind of being this like hyper vigilant, over organized person, Perfectionists might delay kind of doing a task or taking on a project because they want everything to be perfect before they even start, which again is kind of unattainable. Perfect doesn't exist. And it's kind of that idea of like stopping yourself before you even begin. And for a lot of people, perfectionism can lead to anxiety, stress, low self-esteem, things like that. Because again, if we're trying to chase the unattainable, we're just setting ourselves up for failure. That inner critic is never that helpful. It's rarely nice at all. And you're just kind of putting yourself in that constant like fight or flight of being like, oh, I need to do this. It needs to be right. It needs to be perfect. And that can really just kind of tee us up for struggling with some things like long-term, like anxiety, stress, all of that. Now, some of the ways that, at least for me, I don't always think is obvious or like overt signs of perfectionism that can pop up are things like over-planning and overthinking. So this is one where if you're a perfectionist, you might like excessively plan and overthink. And again, it's kind of that like fear of failure, or you're trying to account for like every possible detail or every possible scenario, have a plan for it, and not leaving any space for the fact that it's like, life is going to happen. Life is going to life while you are trying to do different things. You can plan, and I think about this a lot in like the context of motherhood. Like I can try to plan for like every single scenario or even like every single like risk or danger possible for Pork Chop and Poppy, but like sometimes life is still going to happen and you'll never be able to be like completely 100% prepared, planned, organized for every situation. It's impossible. It can't happen. Also, difficulty delegating was one that surprised me at first, but this is actually something that I used to struggle with a lot. So perfectionists often find it challenging to delegate tasks to others just because they want it done like their way and they want to make sure that it meets their high standards. But this is something that can result in burnout. It can result in stress. And basically it leads to then you doing all the things all the time. And I think it was around the time like when Pork Chop was born, just after that, when I realized that like I needed a little bit more support, a little more help, that I had to really challenge myself and my own thoughts around like how much of this, and this is kind of in the workplace. So like in Yoga for You, how much do I need to be doing and what aspects do I not need to be doing? And chances are there's someone out there that could be doing them better. And I never really thought of my inability or my unwillingness to delegate things as a sign of perfectionism. But as I started really kind of diving in to perfectionism, like for this episode, it made so much sense to me because I was like, oh my gosh, that is true. It's like, I just, I would love for everything to be done my way. Again, not in like a, I do it the best way, I guess, but more in this like, well, I don't want like the experience on the other side for like my students and things to be any different. And I just had such high standards for myself and the way these things were getting done that I felt like, no one would take it as seriously as me, or no one could, take on that project like I could. And that just wasn't the truth. And really my inability or my unwillingness to delegate in the long run was kind of hurting myself because it was just leading to burnout. And also it just meant that things kind of just didn't get done because I can't do it all. We can't do it all. You can't do it all. Like at some point we will all meet our threshold and be like, okay, I'm, operating at max, which we shouldn't be operating at max all the time, 24/7, but we'll all hit our limit sometimes. And then we need to recognize when we've hit that and we've taken on what we can take on. And then the rest we need to delegate or release or whatever. But that one really that was one of those where I read it and I was like, oh, well, raise your hand if you've struggled with that one, because that's me. Another aspect of perfectionism can be difficulty accepting praise. And this really goes with, I think, kind of that strong inner critic, is that it may be really hard if you're struggling with perfectionism to accept compliments or praise for your achievements. Maybe you downplay your successes a lot. You might say, oh, I just got lucky or something else. And To me, this feels a lot like kind of verbalizing and making that internal critic, kind of like bringing it to the surface and kind of that external. And it is hard, I think, to accept compliments or to accept praise at times, just like in general for anyone. I think that's just sort of a tricky thing. Maybe this is, something I need to do some work on. But I think it can be hard, and especially when you're struggling with perfectionism, because if you internally feel like nothing you do is really good enough or quote like perfect, it can be really hard to hear from others that they perceive what you're doing to be good enough, because those two things like don't really align. And then there's all or nothing thinking. So some perfectionists have a tendency towards kind of this like black and white thinking. So a lot of times this will show up in outcomes of anything that they're doing or working on. Either it was a success or a total failure. And like there's no in between. There's no, this one was really good. Maybe I'd do it a little bit differently next time. Or I'm really proud of myself for taking this first step. I know it'll be even better next time. It's like either it was great or it was horrible. And there's no space for in between, for, being human, for learning, for growing. But that's definitely something that can be a sign of that perfectionism. And then self-censorship. So perfectionists sometimes have a tendency to really censor what they have to say, mostly for like that fear of feeling like you're going to be judged, or people aren't going to understand you, or they're not going to like you, because there is a strong correlation between perfectionists and also people pleasers, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it's just kind of this like, you just hold yourself back again for fear of like what other people will think or perceive or how it'll go. And then some of the more physical symptoms or ways that perfectionism can show up is sometimes it can manifest in like headaches, stomach aches, right? Like tummy troubles. Basically any of those physical symptoms that you get after you're when you're in this like really stressed state for a long time. Because if you're operating at this, max capacity, trying to achieve the unachievable all the time, every day, like that not only is going to cause a lot of mental and emotional stress, but a lot of physical stress too. Like our bodies aren't built to do that, to always be operating at like 200%, trying to achieve the unachievable. And then we have kind of setting unrealistic goals and having your self-worth tied to your achievements. So these are two of my personal brand of perfectionism, setting unrealistic goals. So, pretty self-explanatory, but just setting goals that are virtually impossible to achieve, or setting goals so that you're always constantly a little bit dissatisfied or unhappy, or feeling like you're never measuring up, or you're never getting enough done. You're never, it's just kind of that never, 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 never mindset. But mostly it's just because, you're not being super realistic. And this is me, like, this is definitely one of my like soft spots, is setting unrealistic goals. Like famously, it's like this joke now of like, I'll come home, people will be like, oh, how was your day? I'm like, oh, it was good. And they'll say, did you get a lot done? And, because usually I leave for work and I'm like, oh, I have this and this and this going on. And so my family will ask, like, did you get a lot done? And they'll almost like finish the sentence before I can. And they're like, yeah, I got a lot done, but not as much as I would like to. And it just became like, I just started saying that so much that now it's kind of like this family like joke that basically especially my to-do list and what I think is like achievable and attainable in like one singular day is just not realistic. And so every day I'm like, yeah, it was good, but and then it's always like, but I couldn't get this done or whatever. And then self-worth tied to achievements. This is something too that I have really had to kind of deprogram and reprogram myself for. So often with perfectionism, you will have a tendency to tie your self-worth solely to your achievements. So it's like your self-esteem will increase when you feel like your performance is increasing and you're getting external validation, and like you feel like you're really achieving something or something goes really well. But then on the flip side, if you don't feel like you're doing a lot or achieving a lot, or, just doing all the things all the time, your self-esteem will dip. And this is probably one of the ones that is just so apparent in my own life that I personally have had to do so much work on, is recognizing that like my worth and like who I am as a person is completely separate from my actual achievements. And I still struggle with this one sometimes. Like I think as I transitioned into motherhood in particular, I felt like, I don't know, I really struggled internally with feeling like I wasn't, quote, doing a lot, even sometimes like in pregnancy, because I'll have to like work from bed or like take a nap, and it feels very lazy to me, which it's not, because my body is working really hard to like grow human life. But it's just something that I have to really check myself on. And one of the many things that I love about meditation and mindfulness, but meditation in particular, is that as you learn to be an objective observer of what's happening around you and within you, which is a big piece of meditation, I find it a lot easier now to dig a little bit deeper and to kind of step outside of myself and ask kind of like, okay, like, why am I feeling this way? Or kind of challenging my beliefs in a way. So being like, okay, I feel like, I worked from bed today, and that's, quote, like lazy. I can kind of be that objective observer and be like, is that actually what's going on? And I can deconstruct some of that. But I realized when I became a mother and my capacity to work, because I used to, for Yoga for You, for Mindful Minutes, everything, it was like constant doing, like foot on the accelerator, building, growing, this thing, that thing. And I still do a lot, and I recognize that. But when I became a mom and really started working a little bit more part-time on my business, which I'd never really done before, I really struggled with it, feeling like I just had to kind of question a lot of my own beliefs around like motherhood and working. It was almost like all of these things bubbled up to the surface that I didn't even know I had strong feelings about until I was like in it. And I think part of my struggle was that it's hard to quantify achievements in motherhood like it is in like business, right? So I can say, oh, soon Mindful Minutes will be 6 years old, and I've done this many podcast episodes and, whatever, right? I can kind of quantify the growth of like this podcast or the success of this podcast, or I can say, oh, and I've written a book and I wrote it and it's published. Like it's really easy to quantify those like achievements. But when it comes to like, at least for me, being a parent and being a mother, is that it's such kind of like a gradual thing. It also tends to be a more thankless job, but you can't quite quantify. Of course, I could say, oh, pork chop has made it to 3 or whatever. But you don't get kind of those same like stats that can be kind of that instant gratification and way to look at like your, quote, achievements. And so then I think it's harder to feel like, oh, I did this thing in my job and it got this output and I feel good about that, as opposed to like being a mother. I had to recognize that that mindset just wasn't going to serve me well. And it really, I had kind of this internal conflict for a little bit when I was figuring out work and motherhood and what I wanted my balance to be and what I wanted it to look like. And it really just shined a light on how much I personally put my self-worth on my achievements and also my productivity. And I had to do a lot of work on that. I'm still working on it. So yeah, so that's it's a little bit about me. But, I think that it's important too to make this distinction of kind of like some perfectionism can be healthy, right? Like goal setting isn't bad. Having high expectations, as long as they're realistic, isn't bad. It's only when we start to like dip into the unattainable that it starts to get kind of tricky. It starts to maybe not get so healthy for us when we just take things too far and, we are just having these unrealistic expectations. We are being motivated to improve and, all the time and like never just practicing like contentment in ourselves or what we're doing, having this like debilitating fear of failure, all of these things. So it's kind of like when we, sort of dip into the unhealthy, where we really start to get into a little bit of trouble with perfectionism. So I just shared a little bit about like my own personal brand of perfectionism, but the reason that I want to share a little bit more is because I never used to think of myself as a perfectionist. Like I'd be like, oh, well, I send things out with typos all the time, which I do. And like, you guys roast me because there's like spelling typos and stuff. And, I haven't fully mastered my dyslexia, or I'll make mistakes, or I'll, do the best I can. And my mom one time said, done is better than none. And I have really embraced that of just being like, you know what, like done is better than none, because again, like perfection doesn't exist. And I think I really started to embrace that early on just because of the struggles that I had with ADHD, with dyslexia. Like perfection was just never a thing that I don't know. No, certainly no one was saying that I was perfect, and certainly I wasn't thinking that what I was doing was perfect. And if anything, people were, really kind of hard on me and being like, oh, well, her, like reading and writing is hard, or she has this learning disability, whatever it is. And that just, I don't know. I felt like I learned from a really young age, like perfection doesn't exist and it's not attainable, like for me. And so it's been easier to then apply that for like my whole life, because really it doesn't exist. But it wasn't until I started to dive into some of these other sides of perfectionism, like having really, really high unrealistic standards for yourself, like having your self-worth tied to your achievements and your productivity. Sometimes even like over planning in a way, like these more subtle ways that perfectionism can show up, that my eyes really opened to being like, oh shoot, maybe this is something that I need to explore and like look at. Like I found that probably the top way that perfectionism has been showing up, has shown up in my life, is the high standards and the unrealistic expectations, specifically for what I can accomplish in a day. So, I already told you my family lovingly kind of teases me for this, but I will create these like massive, huge, long like to-do lists. It's just like 9 million things. And I would find that I'd have this huge to-do list, and I had to reframe the way I looked at it, is that what I was writing wasn't actually a to-do list. I was writing it would be nice if list. But I didn't see it that way for quite a while. I was like, no, this is my to-do list. I need to do all of these things, even though it was not even possible for like 3 people at a time to get all of these tasks done that I would just write, and they'd be so long. And then I would measure how, quote, good of a day I had based on how many things I had just checked off the list. I mean, like, well, I got through most of my to-do list today, so it was a pretty good day. And that way of thinking wasn't necessarily serving me that well. One, it was creating more clutter in my own mind, because I would just have this like huge list of things to do, and then I would look at it and I wouldn't get it all done. And so I just put myself in this spiral of just chronically feeling behind. And it wasn't until I realized what I was doing again was writing this it would be nice if list instead of like a true to-do list, like what actually needs to be done. And I found that when I started looking at it, those two different ways, is that maybe I start with my it would be nice if list, and then I could pull out the things that actually needed to go on my to-do list and then work on getting those done. And the to-do list is always so much smaller than the it would be nice if list. And then also just recognizing that like my value and also like the value of a day is so much greater than just how many arbitrary things I could like check off a list. Like it just was really opening to me when I realized that I was tying my productivity and my achievement so closely to like my worth, or how, quote, like good of a day something was, when really it didn't have a big correlation between the two, because I could have a fantastic day that wasn't necessarily a productive day, or I could have a really productive day that isn't necessarily that great of a day. And it had nothing to do with like how many things I could just check off a list. And then, like I shared with you, struggling to delegate. This was something that I really had to look at myself closely and sit with and ask myself, like, why is this such a struggle for me, especially after pork chop came and I realized that I just didn't have the time to do everything myself like I used to. And I also really recognized some of the burnout within myself as well, doing all of the things all the time, just myself. So that definitely was one of those, one of those things. And I think with most people, I don't even know if this necessarily, I can only speak for myself, goes with my perfectionism or just like my existence in general. But I I tend to be hard on myself. I think we all have a tendency to be our own worst critics. But I think in particular, when I was starting this business and also like with this podcast too, like if there was a 1-star review, and I know we've talked about how like we're wired to have like a negativity bias, but I just used to really hold on to some of that. And I'm talking like just a negative review, not like anything like helpful, like valid, like criticism or anything like that. Just like kind of ridiculous. Like this person doesn't know what they're, talking about. I hate this woman's voice or whatever, which is like, I'm sorry. I can't really do anything about that. But I used to hold on to that stuff like for days. And it would be the thing where like, you can have 30 people come up to you and 29 of them say something that's kind or even just neutral. And then you have the one person that says something like not as nice. And that's the thing that like you hold on to. And I found that the reason some of those stung so badly was because it was like they were reflecting the fear and the insecurity that like my own internal critic had been sharing with me for so long. And that's why it stung, is, really stung. It still stings, guys. So I do still, like when I read reviews and stuff, because they're, so many of them are so nice and so lovely. And it's like really, really kind and sweet, the things that you guys write there. But then every once in a while, there's just, something there that's not nice or is quite negative. And, it still stings. But I think as I embarked on my own kind of like perfectionism healing journey, which I'm still on, is when I realized that like often the things that sting the most is because it's like validating what your own internal critic has been saying to you. And I had to work on the way that I spoke to myself, thought of myself. This is something that I've been working on my entire life and that I'm still working on. And again, we're all our own worst critics. But it was really eye-opening to me when I realized that the reason some of these negative things stuck to me for so long was because it was basically validating my inner critic, which has often been very loud. That's also the part that always says like, do more, be more, work more. That kind of perfectionism side is the side that I've always struggled with. And so again, learning how to be like an objective observer, being able to sit with it and say, okay, like, why is this bothering me so much? Why am I feeling so hurt by this thing? Like, what's going on here has been so helpful for me, because once you kind of see it and can name it, that's where then you can start to do some more actionable things to either work on it or heal it or release it or whatever you feel like you need to do. But until you have that like clarity, or at least a little bit of clarity on it, it's hard. It can feel like kind of murky. It can be hard to distinguish like, what is this? And then once you figure out what it is, you can do something about it. All right, so switching gears here and looking at maybe some ways, some reflections, some ideas, or if you find yourself struggling with perfectionism in any of these capacities. And also, I'm not a mental health professional, but I have, as someone who has had to work on their own personal perfectionism, just some ideas on how to work on it, how to soften it, and maybe even like reframe the way that you look at it. So the first thing is going to be asking yourself, is this a realistic standard? So if you are feeling really stressed out, maybe there's a certain project, there's a certain thing that you have to get done or that you want done, and you can ask yourself, is this a realistic standard? Or I like to think of it sometimes as, would I expect this from a friend or a colleague or a loved one? And again, we know perfection doesn't exist, right? But this could be something, it could certainly be a work project. It also could be like something in your life. So, for me, maybe that would look like, how quickly I get back into things after having baby Poppy, or what I do after giving birth, what my body can do after giving birth, and hitting that pause button and being like, is this a realistic standard? If my friend or my sister came to me and said, I just feel like I need to be, whatever, riding a bike 1 week after having a baby, which is not I don't feel like I need to do that. But if they came to me with something like that, and I'd be like, what are you talking about? You just gave birth. You don't need to be doing that. And so I think sometimes when we feel that pressure of getting it right, of getting it perfect, of always improving, of always doing more, just stop, pause button, and say, is this a realistic standard? If someone that I cared about came to me and told me that this was their standard for themselves, would I be like, yeah, that sounds good and realistic? Or would I be like, that doesn't sound super attainable? And for me, this has really helped of just kind of like, is this realistic? Because we have such a tendency to set realistic and achievable goals and standards for others, but then taking it much farther for ourselves. So I think that when we look at it as, this is a standard that someone else would set, we're able to look at it a little bit more clearly as to whether or not it's realistic. I personally have found that to be really helpful. And also just recognizing that making mistakes is part of learning and growth. Maybe considering what a more realistic standard might be and being softer and kinder with yourself. If you do find they have a tendency to set these unrealistic standards, maybe you can look at it and, hit that pause button and say, is this realistic? And you say no. Then you can think about, okay, now reframe it, maybe soften it a little bit. What would be more realistic? Maybe it's, I don't know, getting back on a bike like 2 months after you had a kid. I don't know. I don't know why that popped into my head. I'm not even really like a bike riding kind of gal, but whatever. You can then say, what would be a more realistic expectation for someone else? And then you can apply that to yourself. And I have found that to be really helpful. The other thing is going to be challenging negative self-talk. And this is playing one of my favorite games, that I picked up in therapy, which is it a thought or is it a truth? And basically what you're going to do is you're going to challenge your negative self-talk. You can go tell your inner critic. You can go kick rocks. And you're going to challenge thoughts by asking yourself, is this a thought or is this a truth? And taking it even a step further and say, and this is all, I can't take any credit for this. This is my therapist, but it does help. And ask yourself, is this rational? And is there any evidence to back this up? So you can pick any expectation, anything that you think should be, quote, perfect, right? And then you can say, you basically ask yourself, is this a thought or is this a truth? So we have a lot of thoughts throughout our day. We have I think they say 20,000 thoughts in a day, which is like as many drops of water it takes to fill up a gallon of water. So we have 20,000 thoughts a day. Many, many, many of them are not truths. There's only a few in there that are truths, right? You can say to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm so lazy. I didn't get this thing done today. I can't believe it. I wasted a day. And we kind of get in that inner spiral. Pause and say, is this a truth or is this a fact? Is this a truth or is this a thought? And then you're going to say, is there any evidence that really backs up that I'm lazy? The answer is probably no. There's no evidence to really support that you are a lazy person. And not only do I love the is it a truth or is it a thought game, but then asking yourself, and if you're like, I'm not sure, just say, is there any evidence that makes this a truth? All of the truths, you'll be able to pull some evidence and say, yes, I do. Maybe the truth there is probably I'm a very high achieving, hardworking individual. And today I needed some downtime to recuperate. So I didn't do as much. That's probably more of the truth. Is there evidence to support that? Yeah, likely you can point to a bunch of things that you've been working on. Maybe you can point to how your body has been feeling. And then that's going to validate that you are a high achieving, hardworking individual who also needs days where you do a little bit less so that you can recoup. That's a truth versus the thought of I'm lazy. So playing that game and then looking for any evidence to support it. If you can't pull any evidence for it, it's just not a truth. And then something else that you actually did, if you did the companion meditation that goes with this freeform episode, is visualizing your inner critic or your negative self-talk, like walking away. So like truly removing it. You can pack it up in a box. It can walk away and go into another room. It can, shrink down really small, anything like that. Like personifying your inner critic and then sort of removing that part of you can be really helpful and be like, okay, just step aside for a little bit. You're going in the back seat. I'm not listening to you right now. You're not helping me right now. I have found sometimes that can be helpful too when I just recognize like my inner critic is being really hard, just being like, you know what? I need a break. So I need you to go take a little time out over here. And then if you want to, your inner critic always finds its way back, unfortunately. But sometimes I find that like sitting and meditating and visualizing like my inner critic or my negative self-talk is kind of separating from me and going to like take a time out. And for whatever reason, I find that helps at times. Also learning how to prioritize tasks. So if you're someone struggling with perfectionism, again, this comes from my own experience of the it would be nice if list versus the to-do list, and really prioritizing your tasks and focusing your energy on like the most important ones. It will feel like they're all so important, but they can't all be equally important. Not everything is going to require the same level of attention and detail. And so looking at your task, what you would like to do, what you need to do, and identify kind of what truly matters, and then you can allocate your resources accordingly. And practicing being okay with not getting everything done and saying, okay, like here's the things that I actually need to do, or these are the top priorities. If nothing else gets done, then that's okay. And it'll feel really hard, especially if you're working on perfectionism, to not do all the things all the time, but just start small. And you can look at your to-do list and say, okay, what's one thing that's not a very high priority that if it doesn't get done, it's okay. And you can just practice doing that for a little bit, and then you can build yourself up to continue to work on that. Also, sometimes I find setting time limits on certain things and certain projects can help, especially when you have those things that you want to get it like just right. You want it to be perfect, which again doesn't exist, but saying, okay, I'm going to give myself X amount of time. And then when it's done, it's done. And I do this a lot with my meditation students that are really struggling with perfectionism, because it does show up in meditation too, where people want to do it, quote, right. And it's like they can't even begin a meditation practice because they're so worried that they aren't like, quote, doing it right, or they stop themselves before they start. And I always tell them, and I say, and then you're just going to do your best for 10 minutes. And then those 10 minutes are up. That's it. And then done. You're not going to worry about it until the next day. And a lot of my perfectionist students I work with one-on-one, and this is not to like shade my students at all. I love them so much. But I have found that in particular, sometimes people who want to work one-to-one to start a meditation practice is someone who has a tendency towards perfectionism because they just want to make sure that they're doing it, quote, right. And so it shows up truly in any aspect of your life. And so I'll do kind of this set time limits thing with them and say, there is no, quote, perfect meditation. It's not a meditation perfect. It's a meditation practice. So we're just going to try our best, and whatever happens, happens. There's really no good or bad meditation practice. It's all equal, and you're just going to set your timer for X amount of minutes, and then when it's done, it's done. And then you can try your best again tomorrow. And I have found that this sometimes really helps kind of this like, I'll allow myself to work on this thing for X amount of time, but then when the timer goes off, then I'm done with it, either for the day or altogether. And then reframing how you think about mistakes. So often you'll hear me talk about reframing the way we think about distractions in meditation, but it's a similar idea when you look at like mistakes. So understanding that making a quote mistake, I'm doing the air quotes, it's all a normal part of the learning process. So instead of like fearing a mistake or avoiding a mistake like at all cost, doing our best to embrace when we can mistakes as an opportunity to learn, to learn and improve, and kind of challenging your beliefs around what will happen if I make a mistake. Because often we build it up to be such a big thing in our heads and in our hearts, and we say, we're so scared of making a mistake. But challenging that a little bit and being like, well, what would be the worst thing that would happen, right? And there are definitely some things that, if you work in healthcare and you make a particular mistake, like something really bad might happen. But often for mistakes, it can be smaller things where it's like, if I, don't get this perfectly grammatically correct, I don't know, like, if I send this out and it has one little typo in it, is it that big of a deal? No. Is it kind of embarrassing? Yeah. Is it like, oh, shoot, I did that? Is an opportunity to learn? Yeah. And so thinking about really just reframing the way we think about mistakes. And I find this to be really helpful too, of thinking about how I respond to my own mistakes compared to how I would respond to the mistakes of those that are close to me. So whether it's pork chop or whether it's a friend of mine and they're like, oh my gosh, I feel so silly, or I'm so down on myself because I made this mistake. And often I'm like, oh my gosh, like, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. It's okay. Think about all that you learned. And I'm so quick to like hype others up. But then when I make a little mistake, it's like you hold on to it. And so really reframing the way that we not only think about mistakes as being like these learning opportunities, just like we think about distractions and meditation as an opportunity to build our concentration muscle, but then also thinking about like, what are the true repercussions of this mistake? Chances are they're not that big. And would I respond this way if like a loved one made this mistake? Probably not. So then practicing self-compassion. So this ties right in, treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend. And really, I have found this to be one of the most beneficial practices for perfectionism is, would I hold someone else to the same standard? Would I be this hard on someone that I loved if they made this mistake? Would I expect, the unattainable of others in my life? No. So why am I doing that to myself? And realizing it was more of a me problem and focusing on practicing self-compassion. And then 2 more things here that I have found to be helpful. One is seeking out feedback from someone that you know, like, and trust. And this can feel really scary. It can be really vulnerable. Only do this if, you're feeling brave, and ask someone that, will be very kind and soft with you at first. But you can ask people for feedback. And the reason that I kind of put this on the list is, even though it'll feel scary, chances are that the feedback they're giving you is going to be so much more positive than the feedback that you're giving yourself. And I found this to be a particularly good exercise, like when I was working on perceiving other people's expectations of me. And realizing that, like, even if I felt like I wasn't doing a good enough job, or I wasn't working hard enough, or I wasn't achieving enough, that's not what other people thought. And so sometimes and it does feel a little uncomfy. I will definitely put that out there. It's a little scary at first, but just being like, hey, how do you think I did on this project? Or, hey, what do you think of, this, or whatever it is? And just asking people for feedback, I think sometimes can help open your eyes as to how great other people perceive you to be. And then finally, learning to say no and setting boundaries. Boundaries are our best friends. It's just perfectionists often take on so much because they just worry that others, won't meet their standards, that they're going to let someone down. Maybe they're experiencing a tendency towards people pleasing. And so learning how to say no when you have too much on your plate and prioritizing self-care, like establishing boundaries, is essential. So maybe consider making like a boundaries list, which is really hard, but you can write a list of basically things, or think about a list of things that are like your hard boundaries. Like, I will not work past this time, or I will not answer my work phone past this time, or, whatever it is. And you could kind of write a little bit of a boundaries list, but learning how to say no so that you aren't taking on too much and learning how to set boundaries can be incredibly useful when you're trying to combat or remedy perfectionism. And then, of course, this one isn't even necessarily a thing because I was going to put it here, but meditation can help. I did try to look into some of the research and if there's a correlation between meditation and perfectionism. And what I found is that there is a small correlation between those who meditate and those who have a tendency for overworking and burnout and setting unrealistic expectations for themselves. So that was exciting. But I have found too that just meditation in general, it not only allows me to become that objective observer so I can look at some of these tendencies a little bit more clearly so that then I can start to work on some of them. But it also, like, meditation's so good at helping you to live in the now and helping you to clear some of that mental clutter. And then loving kindness meditation in particular is one that has helped me. And that's kind of working on that self-compassion piece. So building up your heart muscle, your self-love muscle, your self-understanding and compassion muscle through loving kindness. Meditation I have found to be particularly helpful in terms of like styles of meditation and what works really well with perfectionism. And then just remember that you can start small. This is something, I'm still working on my perfectionism, and it takes a while to kind of deconstruct and reconstruct some of these things. So just start small, be kind and patient with yourself. You don't have to do it all all at once, and piece by piece, maybe you'll find a little bit of relief there. So I hope this helps. I hope this gave you some food for thought. Everyone that's been asking for thoughts and reflections on perfectionism. And yeah, that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here. There is a perfectionism meditation, the way that the calendar worked out. I know usually I do the freeform first and then the episode or the meditation after, but I mixed it up this time just because with how the month fell, it didn't quite align. But so you already have a perfectionism meditation. It's the one right before this one in your feed. And I incorporate some of these techniques into that practice. So I hope this helps. And I hope that wherever you are, you're just having a wonderful, beautiful day. And thank you so much for joining me here.